Black Legion occupied a unique position among the traitor legions. Where other Chaos Space Marine forces might follow a single deity with fanatical devotion, Abaddon's warriors served Chaos undivided. This pragmatic approach to damnation made them paradoxically more dangerous. They could adapt, incorporate elements from any faction, absorb warbands regardless of their patron god. As long as a warrior would bow before Abaddon the Despoiler and swear the oath of obedience, they could wear the black and gold. This philosophy extended to recruitment. The Legion needed bodies to transform into Astartes, and they acquired them through the most direct means available. Raids on Imperial worlds that prioritized capturing healthy adolescent males over mere destruction. When the Black Legion struck a world, their attacks followed patterns refined over 10,000 years of warfare. They identified population centers with high concentrations of physically viable candidates. Hive cities proved particularly lucrative, their underhives teeming with feral youth hardened by gang warfare and survival in toxic environments. Agricultural worlds offered different opportunities, producing hardy specimens accustomed to physical labor. Even night worlds occasionally suffered these raids, their aristocratic houses targeted specifically because their bloodlines had been genetically optimized over generations for physical and mental excellence. The Legion cared nothing for the candidates' origins, only their biological compatibility with the gene seed implantation process, and their capacity to survive the brutal transformation ahead. The raids themselves were masterpieces of terror. The Black Legion did not announce their presence with honor or challenge. They materialized from the warp in orbital space with coordinates calculated to maximize the element of surprise. Drop pods and boarding craft descended on carefully selected targets before local defense forces could properly mobilize. The attackers moved with transhuman speed and precision, their power armor painted in the ominous black that had become synonymous with Abaddon's forces. They killed anyone who resisted with casual efficiency, their bolters reducing human defenders to red mist and shattered bone. Those who fled found themselves herded by the attackers into collection points, where chaos cultists and human auxiliaries processed them with disturbing mechanical efficiency. The selection process during raids demonstrated the Legion's cold practicality. Chaos Space Marines possessed enhanced senses that allowed them to assess potential candidates with a glance. They evaluated bone structure, muscle development, hormonal indicators visible through scent, the subtle tells of genetic abnormalities. Boys between 12 and 15 years of age received priority, their bodies young enough that the gene seed organs might successfully integrate but old enough that they had developed sufficient skeletal and muscular foundation. Anyone older faced significantly reduced survival rates during implantation. Anyone younger risked developmental complications that rendered the entire process wasteful. The traitor legions operated with margins far thinner than their loyalist counterparts, every failed transformation representing irreplaceable resources squandered. Those selected for capture found themselves separated from the general population of prisoners. The latter group faced various grim fates, slavery in the Eye of Terror's demon forges, sacrifice in dark rituals to appease the ruinous powers, transformation into the twisted servitors that maintained chaos vessels, or simply being hurled into the warp as offerings to entities whose appetites transcended mortal comprehension. The chosen candidates received marginally better treatment, their value as potential Astartes, affording them protection from the worst immediate horrors. They were confined in specialized holding cells, fed nutrient paste designed to maintain their health, and subjected to preliminary medical examinations by what passed for apothecaries among the traitor legions. These examinations revealed the first hints of what awaited the captives. The Chaos apothecaries bore little resemblance to their loyalist equivalents. Centuries or millennia in the Eye of Terror had transformed them into creatures that straddled the boundary between human and something else entirely. Their armor bore the Narthesium equipment that marked their role, but the tools themselves showed signs of demonic corruption. Medical instruments grew teeth. Diagnostic equipment leaked substances that defied chemical analysis. The apothecaries themselves displayed mutations that their loyalist brothers would have considered abominations worthy of immediate execution. Extra limbs emerged from their torsos, useful for conducting complex surgical procedures but disturbing in their arachnoid arrangement. Eyes multiplied across their helmets, some biological and some clearly demonic in origin, granting them perceptions that extended beyond merely physical sight. The candidates were stripped, measured, and categorized with efficiency that suggested long practice. Blood samples were extracted through needles that seemed to drink rather than merely draw. Tissue biopsies were taken from multiple locations, the wounds cauterized with instruments that burned with warp-tainted flames that left the flesh marked with patterns that would never fully fade. Genetic compatibility was assessed through methods that borrowed as much from sorcery as science. Runes carved into the candidate's flesh, temporarily glowing as they reacted to the stolen gene seed that might soon be implanted within them. Those who failed these preliminary tests were removed from the candidate pool, their fate left deliberately ambiguous, but certainly nothing approaching mercy. The successful candidates faced an immediate psychological assault even before the physical transformation began. They were exposed to propaganda that sought to break their imperial conditioning and replace it with devotion to chaos. Servitor skulls drifted through their cells, voxcasters embedded in their hollow eye sockets broadcasting continuous streams of corrupting philosophy. The Emperor was portrayed not as humanity's protector, but as a false god who had betrayed his own sons, forcing them into rebellion through his tyranny and lies. Horus was lionized as a tragic hero who had seen the truth and fought to free humanity from divine oppression. The Imperium became a prison rather than a sanctuary, its endless wars and grinding oppression offered as evidence of its fundamental illegitimacy. Hour after hour, day after day, the messages repeated, varied, reinforced themselves through psychological techniques that combined pre-heresy imperial conditioning methodologies with insights gained from demonic entities that understood the malleability of mortal consciousness. Some candidates resisted, clinging to their faith in the Emperor even as the evidence of their abandonment surrounded them. These individuals proved particularly valuable to the Black Legion. A mind that could maintain conviction in the face of contradictory evidence possessed strength that could be redirected once properly broken. The Legion employed specialists in psychological torture who worked with patient precision to identify each candidate's breaking point. They exploited fears, magnified doubts, constructed elaborate scenarios that forced candidates to confront impossible moral choices. A boy who watched hololithic recordings of his family being slowly consumed by warp entities, knowing he could stop their suffering by simply renouncing the Emperor, discovered exactly how much psychological stress his faith could endure before it finally shattered. Others broke more quickly, their belief systems never deeply rooted enough to withstand genuine assault. They accepted the Legion's narrative with disturbing speed, their minds performing the necessary cognitive gymnastics to reconcile their previous loyalties with their current circumstances. These candidates presented different challenges. A mind that changed allegiances too easily might prove unreliable during the intense psycho-conditioning that accompanied the implantation process. The apothecaries monitored such individuals carefully, watching for signs of opportunistic compliance versus genuine ideological conversion. The Black Legion wanted warriors who believed in their cause, not merely survivors who would mouth whatever words kept them alive. The physical transformation could not begin until sufficient gene seed became available. The Black Legion faced constraints that Loyalist chapters avoided. Their gene seed had been corrupted by millennia of exposure to the warp, the once pure genetic material of the lunar wolves twisted by chaos into something unstable and prone to rejection. The Legion compensated through multiple strategies, none of them remotely ethical by imperial standards. They harvested gene seed from fallen brothers, their apothecaries recovering the progenoid glands from corpses even in the midst of battle. They raided Loyalist chapter monasteries specifically to steal uncontaminated gene seed, prizes so valuable that entire campaigns were organized around securing them. They maintained diplomatic relations with Fabius Bile, the infamous primogenitor, who provided freshly cloned gene seed in exchange for slaves and other resources whose nature was best left unexamined. The gene seed itself required preparation before implantation. Loyalist chapters grew their genetic material in sterile conditions under the supervision of techmarines who maintained the purity of the Omnissire's gifts. The Black Legion possessed no such luxuries. Their gene seed was cultured in vats filled with nutrient solutions that incorporated warp-touched compounds, substances that would horrify any Mars-trained techmarine, but which the Chaos apothecaries insisted improved compatibility rates. The resulting organs grew faster than their Loyalist equivalents, but displayed disturbing characteristics. Progenoid glands sometimes developed tooth-like structures. Osmodular organs pulsed with internal light that suggested demonic contamination. Multi-lungs occasionally produced respiratory sounds that resembled whispered words in languages that predated human civilization. The implantation process itself bore superficial similarities to the procedures used by Loyalist chapters, but differed in crucial ways that reflected the Black Legion's corruption. Loyalist implantation followed the sacred sequence developed during the Great Crusade, each organ introduced at specific developmental stages to allow the candidate's body to adapt. The process took years, carefully measured and monitored by experienced apothecaries who understood that rushing risked rejection or worse. The Black Legion possessed neither the time nor the patience for such careful work. They compressed the implantation timeline, introducing multiple organs simultaneously and relying on warp-infused chemical cocktails to force the candidate's biology to accept the foreign tissues. The pain was indescribable, beyond what any analgesic could fully suppress, and candidates were kept conscious throughout much of the process because their active participation in accepting the changes increased survival rates. The first implantation targeted the secondary heart, an organ that would eventually provide redundancy and increased cardiovascular capacity. In Loyalist procedures, this organ was introduced early in the sequence, giving it time to integrate fully with the candidate's existing circulatory system. The Black Legion's accelerated timeline meant the secondary heart was forced to begin functioning almost immediately, creating strain on both the new organ and the original heart as they attempted to synchronize. Candidates experienced arrhythmias, periods where their dual heartbeats fell out of phase and their blood pressure fluctuated wildly. Some suffered cardiac events that would have killed unmodified humans, their bodies pushed past normal physiological limits. The apothecaries monitored these crises with clinical detachment, intervening only when death seemed imminent. Those who survived demonstrated the resilience the Legion required. Those who died were harvested for whatever useful biological materials their corpses retained. The os modula came next, implanted alongside the biscopea to create a synergistic transformation of the candidate's musculoskeletal system. These organs would eventually transform ordinary human bone and muscle into the enhanced tissues that gave Astartes their superhuman strength and durability. The process was agonizing under the best circumstances, but the Black Legion's methods magnified the suffering exponentially. The candidate's bones began to grow and harden at accelerated rates, sometimes so quickly that the surrounding soft tissues couldn't adapt. Skin split open as new bone structures pushed outward. Muscles tore and rebuilt themselves repeatedly as the biscopper forced them to bulk beyond their previous capacity. The candidates screamed until their vocal cords gave out, then continued screaming silently as their bodies were essentially disassembled and reconstructed at the cellular level. Throughout this ordeal, the psychological conditioning continued. The candidates were not permitted to retreat into unconsciousness except when medically necessary. They were kept aware, forced to experience every moment of their transformation, while servitor skulls continued their endless propaganda broadcasts. The message evolved as the implantation progressed. Pain was portrayed as purifying, suffering as the price of transcendence. The candidates were told they were being reborn, shedding their weak mortal forms to become something greater. The Chaos Gods watched their transformation with approval. Every moment of agony brought them closer to apotheosis. The weak died. The strong endured. They were becoming strong. Some candidates broke psychologically before their bodies finished transforming. These individuals entered states of catatonia or psychosis, their minds unable to process the sustained trauma of their situation. The Black Legion showed no mercy to such failures. Non-functional candidates were either terminated immediately, or, if their bodies showed sufficient development, converted into servitors. These half-transformed wretches became cautionary examples to other candidates, their lobotomized minds still trapped in bodies that had begun the journey toward transhuman status but would never complete it. They served as mobile reminders that weakness meant a fate worse than death, consciousness reduced to a bare spark of awareness, imprisoned in flesh that had become a cage rather than a vessel. The implantation of the hemastamen and Laraman's organ required particular precision because these organs would modify the candidate's blood itself. The hemastamen would eventually make their blood more efficient at carrying oxygen, while the Laraman's organ would enable rapid clotting and wound sealing. The Black Legion's corrupted versions of these organs produced blood with disturbing properties. It sometimes displayed bioluminescence, glowing faintly in darkness with colours that had no name in human languages. It occasionally demonstrated behaviours that seemed almost intelligent, moving in ways that defied normal fluid dynamics. The apothecaries considered these abnormalities acceptable as long as the organs performed their basic functions. Enhanced healing and improved oxygenation mattered. The exact mechanisms were secondary considerations. The catalepsian node came with its own horrors. This organ allowed Astartes to regulate their sleep patterns, remaining conscious and functional for extended periods. In Loyalist chapters, this augmentation was carefully integrated to avoid psychological damage from prolonged sleep deprivation. The Black Legion's version of the node sometimes became corrupted by warp exposure during the culturing process, producing candidates who experienced disturbing alterations in their conscious experience. Some reported perceiving time differently, moments stretching into subjective hours while hours compressed into subjective seconds. Others described awareness of additional spatial dimensions, their enhanced perception, revealing geometries that mundane human consciousness was never meant to apprehend. These side effects were monitored but not necessarily corrected. If a candidate could function despite their altered perception, the Black Legion considered them viable. The preomnor and omophagia implantation marked a particularly grotesque stage of transformation. These organs granted Astartes the ability to consume virtually any organic matter and extract nutritional value from it, a useful adaptation for warriors who might operate in hostile environments for extended periods. The omophagia also allowed an Astartes to gain information by consuming an enemy's flesh, absorbing neural tissue and extracting memories encoded in the victim's brain structure. For the Black Legion, this capability held additional significance. Candidates who received corrupted versions of these organs sometimes gained more than mere memories when they consumed flesh. They occasionally absorbed fragments of their victims' souls, experiencing phantom emotions and inherited desires that weren't originally their own. Some reported tasting the fear of those they ate, savouring the psychological dimensions of consumption as much as the physical sustenance. The multi-lung implantation subjected candidates to respiratory torture as their bodies learned to process the new organ. Loyalist multi-lungs allowed Astartes to breathe in toxic atmospheres or even underwater for limited periods. The Black Legion's corrupted versions sometimes developed the ability to process warp energies, drawing sustenance from the immaterium itself. Candidates with such organs reported breathing environments that technically contained no oxygen whatsoever, their altered biology extracting what it needed from the psychic emanations that permeated areas of high chaos corruption. This adaptation proved valuable during operations in the Eye of Terror or other warp-saturated regions, but came with the price of making the candidate more susceptible to demonic influence, their respiratory system now serving as a potential vector for possession. The oculobe and Lyman's ear represented sensory transformations that fundamentally altered how candidates perceived reality. The oculobe would eventually grant them vision superior to unmodified humans, with enhanced low-light capability and the ability to perceive electromagnetic spectrums invisible to normal sight. The Lyman's ear would provide them with exceptional hearing and enhanced balance through modifications to their inner ear structure. The Black Legion's versions of these organs sometimes developed unexpected capabilities. Candidates occasionally gained the ability to perceive warp phenomena directly, seeing the currents of chaos that flowed through real space like invisible rivers of malevolent energy. They heard voices speaking from the immaterium, whispers that might convey useful intelligence or might drive them gradually insane depending on their psychological resilience. Throughout all of these implantations, the candidates were never given respite sufficient for full recovery. The Black Legion operated on compressed timelines, impatient to field new warriors against the hated Imperium. Where Loyalist chapters might space implantations across years, the Black Legion measured their schedule in months or sometimes even weeks. The strain this placed on the candidates' bodies and minds was immense. They existed in states of perpetual transformation, their biology never fully stabilizing before the next intervention disrupted it again. Many died from complications that more gradual procedures would have avoided. The Black Legion accepted these losses as inevitable, their attitude toward candidates coldly pragmatic. They possessed more slaves than they had gene seed. Better to push each candidate to their absolute limits and accept the high attrition rate than to waste time on careful procedures that ultimately produced the same number of functional warriors. The Sussen membrane implantation carried particular significance for the Black Legion's operational doctrine. This organ allowed an Astartes to enter a state of suspended animation when mortally wounded, preserving their life until medical assistance arrived. For warriors operating in the warp-saturated environments the Legion preferred, this ability took on additional dimensions. Candidates sometimes entered Susan comas that connected their consciousness to the immaterium, their near-death state creating a bridge between material and spiritual existence. Some returned from these comas with knowledge they should not possess, having experienced visions while their bodies hung suspended between life and death. Others came back changed in subtle ways, their personalities incorporating elements that suggested they had not been entirely alone during their journey into darkness. The transformation of the candidate's brain through implantation of the various neural interface organs marked the point where they ceased being recognizably human in any conventional sense. The catalepsian node modified their sleep patterns. The Susan membrane altered their relationship with consciousness itself. The oculobe rewired their visual cortex. The Lyman's ear changed how they processed auditory information. These transformations accumulated, each one shifting the candidate further from their original baseline human neurology. They began thinking differently, processing information with speeds and patterns that exceeded unaugmented human capability. They experienced reality through sensory frameworks that their original biology could never have supported. They became something else, something that wore the shape of humanity, but had transcended its limitations in directions that the Emperor's original design had never intended. The progenoid glands represented perhaps the cruelest irony of the transformation process. These organs served a single purpose: to replicate gene seed by absorbing genetic information from the candidate's other implanted organs and storing it for future harvest. In Loyalist chapters, the progenoids symbolized the continuity of the Astartes tradition, each fallen warrior giving rise to 2 future brothers through the glands that would be recovered from his body. For the Black Legion's candidates, the progenoids meant something darker. They were being transformed into weapons, yes, but also into resources. Their bodies would become factories producing the very gene seed that would create the next generation of corrupted warriors. Even in death they would serve the Legion, their corpses harvested by apothecaries who cared nothing for honour or remembrance, only for the biological materials contained within transhuman flesh. The black carapace marked the final major implantation, the organ that would allow the candidate to interface directly with power armour. This thin layer of fibrous neural tissue grew beneath the skin, creating connection points across the torso, limbs and spine where armour systems could plug directly into the wearer's nervous system. In Loyalist chapters, this implantation signified the candidate's elevation to full Astartes status, the moment when they transcended their mortal origins completely. The Black Legion performed the procedure with the same accelerated brutality that characterized their entire approach to transformation. The black carapace was forced to grow at unnatural speeds, spreading beneath the skin like an invasive network of alien tissue. Candidates felt it crawling through their bodies, the fibrous connections seeking anchor points in their skeletal structure, wrapping around nerve clusters, burrowing through muscle tissue to reach the surface at predetermined locations. The pain of the black carapace's growth defied easy description. It felt simultaneously like burning and freezing, like being devoured from within by something that was technically part of the candidate's own body, but remained fundamentally alien. The sensation of the tissue moving beneath the skin produced psychological responses that range from intense anxiety to outright body horror. Some candidates attempted to claw at their own flesh, trying to tear out the foreign tissue they could feel but not directly access. The apothecaries restrained such individuals, their patience for this particular complication apparently limitless. They understood that the black carapace's integration provoked intense psychological distress. They simply did not care. The candidates would adapt, or they would die. Either outcome was acceptable. Throughout the implantation process, candidates who survived began to notice changes beyond the merely physical. The psychological conditioning that accompanied their transformation worked on levels both conscious and subconscious. The constant propaganda broadcasts had become background noise, but their messages had sunk deep into the candidates' psyches. They found themselves thinking thoughts that seemed to come from nowhere, accepting premises they had never consciously endorsed. The Emperor was a tyrant. Horus had been right to rebel. The Imperium was a lie built on suffering and oppression. These ideas felt natural, obvious, as if they had always believed them and simply needed the scales removed from their eyes to see the truth that had been there all along. The warp itself contributed to their corruption. The Eye of Terror was not merely a location, but an environment that actively transformed those who dwelled within it. Reality functioned differently there, the boundaries between the materium and the immaterium remaining perpetually thin. Candidates experienced this instability as a constant low-level assault on their sense of what was real. They saw things that could not exist according to the laws of physics they had learned in their previous lives. They heard voices speaking in languages that seemed to bypass their ears entirely and communicate directly with their minds. They felt presences watching them, entities whose attention carried physical weight, pressing down on their consciousness like hands moulding soft clay into new shapes. Some candidates experienced visions during their transformation, their enhanced biology making them more sensitive to warp phenomena than unmodified humans would have been. They glimpsed futures that might be, pasts that perhaps were, and presents existing in parallel dimensions just slightly offset from baseline reality. A candidate might suddenly know with absolute certainty that he would die in battle against Imperial forces on a world he had never heard of, the knowledge arriving complete and detailed like a memory of something that had already happened. Another might remember events from the Horus Heresy with clarity that suggested he had personally witnessed them, despite having been born millennia after those battles ended. These visions were not always false. The warp cared nothing for temporal causality, and information from across time flowed through it, like water seeking its level. The completion of the transformation process brought no ceremony, no recognition of what the candidates had endured. One day they simply found themselves no longer being subjected to surgical procedures. The apothecaries had finished their work, the candidates had survived, had become something new. They were neophytes of the Black Legion. Though they had not yet earned the right to wear that title with pride, their bodies bore the organs of Astartes, but they remained incomplete in ways both physical and spiritual. They had gained transhuman strength, durability, and sensory acuity, but they lacked the training, experience, and ideological commitment that would make them truly valuable to the Legion. The transformation had merely made them raw material slightly more refined than the slaves from which they had been elevated. Now came the true test. The training regime began immediately and proceeded with the same brutal efficiency that had characterized the implantation process. The neophytes were organized into cohorts and assigned to veteran warriors who would serve as their instructors, wardens, and judges. These veterans showed no mercy to their charges. They had survived the long war through 10,000 years of continuous conflict, had witnessed the fall of the Imperium they once served and the endless struggles that followed. They possessed no patience for weakness, no tolerance for failure, no sympathy for suffering. The neophytes would learn to fight or they would die. Those were the only two possibilities the veterans acknowledged. Combat training emphasized close-quarters brutality. The Black Legion had inherited from the Lunar Wolves a doctrine focused on eliminating enemy leadership through rapid, devastating strikes. Neophytes learned to identify command structures, to recognize the signs that indicated who led and who followed. They practiced boarding actions, the violent chaos of fighting through cramped corridors and confined spaces where the enemy had no room to retreat and death came from every direction simultaneously. They drilled in methods of coordinated assault, learning to move as a unit despite their transhuman capabilities that might tempt them toward individual glory. The Legion demanded discipline, the subordination of personal desire to collective purpose. Glory meant nothing. Victory was everything. The neophytes trained with weapons both familiar and strange. Bolters remained the standard armament of Astartes regardless of their allegiance, and the neophytes learned to wield these mass-reactive guns with lethal precision. But they also trained with weapons that bore the marks of chaos corruption, blades that screamed when swung through the air, firearms that seemed to hunger for blood and would occasionally fire of their own accord when enemies drew near. Some weapons appeared to be partially alive, their mechanisms incorporating organic components that pulsed with something resembling a heartbeat. The neophytes learned not to question such things. The weapons worked. Their origins and exact nature were irrelevant compared to their effectiveness in killing the Imperium's servants. Physical conditioning pushed the neophytes to explore the limits of their transformed bodies. They possessed strength that allowed them to crush human skulls with their bare hands, resilience that let them shrug off wounds that would kill unmodified humans instantly, speed that made them blurs when they chose to move at full velocity. But these capabilities required mastery. A neophyte who did not understand his own strength might accidentally destroy equipment he was meant to use, might fail to modulate his movements to account for his enhanced mass and momentum. They trained constantly, learning the parameters of their new physical existence through exhausting repetition. They ran until their secondary hearts were pounding in synchronization with their primary ones. They fought until their enhanced muscles burned with lactic acid buildup that their improved biology struggled to clear. They endured until endurance itself became as natural as breathing. The psychological indoctrination intensified during the training period. The neophytes were subjected to carefully designed scenarios that forced them to confront their lingering attachments to their previous lives. A neophyte might be shown hololithic recordings of his homeworld, then forced to watch as the images dissolved into scenes of that world being subjected to exterminatus, the planetary surface scorched to lifelessness by orbital bombardment. The instructor would then explain that this was the fate of all worlds that resisted the Legion, that sentiment and mercy were luxuries the Long War did not permit. The neophyte would be asked if he mourned his homeworld's destruction. The correct answer was to feel nothing, to recognize that the world had been merely one more imperial holding whose loss advanced the Legion's strategic objectives. Those who showed inappropriate emotional responses faced correction. The methods varied but shared a common purpose: to associate any lingering loyalty to the Imperium with pain and humiliation. A neophyte who wept for his lost family might find himself forced to participate in raids where he personally killed civilians who resembled them. A neophyte who expressed doubt about the righteousness of the Legion's cause might be subjected to sensory deprivation punctuated by psychic assault, his mind battered until it accepted the narratives presented to it, or shattered under the strain. The Black Legion had refined these techniques over millennia. They knew exactly how to break a transhuman mind and rebuild it according to their specifications. Demonic possession presented both an opportunity and a danger during this period. The Black Legion actively encouraged their warriors to seek possession, viewing it as a mark of favour from the Chaos Gods and a source of additional power. Neophytes who showed particular promise might be offered the opportunity to host demons, their enhanced bodies serving as anchors that bound warp entities to the material realm. The process was neither simple nor safe. A demon seeking a host evaluated the candidate's worthiness, and many potential hosts found themselves rejected. Those few whose bodies proved suitable vessels underwent transformations that transcended even what the gene seed implantation had achieved. They became something hybrid, part Astartes and part demon, their flesh warping to accommodate the entity that now shared their existence. The possessed exhibited capabilities that unmodified Astartes could not match. They might display strength that exceeded even transhuman norms, able to tear through ceramite armor with their bare hands transformed into talons. They might manifest psychic abilities despite possessing no native talent, the demon within channeling warp energy through their physical form. Some developed mutations that proved tactically valuable, additional limbs that granted them advantages in melee combat, sensory organs that detected enemies through walls, or biological weapons that grew from their transformed flesh. The Black Legion valued such warriors highly, deploying them as shock troops whose appearance alone could break enemy morale. But possession carried costs that became apparent over time. The demon and the host existed in a constant state of negotiation and struggle, each trying to assert dominance over their shared form. Some hosts maintained control, their will strong enough to compel the demon to obedience. Others found themselves passengers in their own bodies, conscious but unable to influence their actions as the demon seized control. The worst cases involved conflicts where neither host nor demon could establish lasting dominance, the body torn between competing directives until it destroyed itself through the strain of internal warfare. The Black Legion accepted these casualties as inevitable. For every possessed warrior who descended into madness or self-destruction, several more proved valuable assets whose enhanced capabilities justified the risks involved. The neophytes also learned the art of fighting alongside demons as separate entities rather than as hosts. The Black Legion maintained summoning rituals that could tear holes in reality and allow warp creatures to manifest on the battlefield. Neophytes practiced coordinating their attacks with these entities, learning to account for the unpredictable nature of demonic behavior. A bloodletter might charge directly into enemy positions regardless of tactical considerations, its nature compelling it toward mindless violence. A neophyte who understood this could position himself to exploit the chaos the demon created, striking at enemies distracted by the warp creature's assault. A plague bearer might advance slowly, its resilience allowing it to absorb enemy fire that would devastate conventional troops. Neophytes learned to use such entities as mobile cover, advancing behind them while the demons drew the enemy's attention and ammunition. The ideological foundation of the Black Legion required particular emphasis during indoctrination. Unlike many Chaos warbands that served a single god with fanatical devotion, the Black Legion followed Chaos undivided. Neophytes learned to recognize the gifts of all four ruinous powers, to understand when Khorne's martial prowess served the Legion's interests, when Nurgle's endurance proved valuable, when Tzeentch's cunning offered advantages, when Slanesh's perfectionism enhanced performance. They were taught that no single god deserved exclusive worship, that the Legion's strength came from its willingness to draw upon any source of power that advanced its goals. This pragmatic approach to damnation distinguished the Black Legion from other traitor forces and explained why so many disparate warbands eventually swore allegiance to Abaddon. The Warmaster himself loomed over every aspect of the neophytes' training despite his physical absence. They learned his history, how he had been first captain of the Lunar Wolves, how he had stood at Horus's side during the heresy, how he had walked away from the shattered remnants of the Sons of Horus, only to return and forge them into something new. They learned of his 13 Black Crusades, each one a hammer blow against the Imperium that demonstrated both his strategic brilliance and his inexhaustible determination. They learned that Abaddon tolerated no betrayal, that those who broke their oaths to him suffered fates that served as warnings to others. The neophytes understood that they would eventually swear such an oath themselves, and that once spoken, it would bind them until death. The oath ceremony occurred only after the neophytes had completed their training and proven themselves worthy. The survivors, fewer now than the cohort that had begun training together, assembled in a chamber decorated with trophies taken from fallen enemies. Helms of loyalist Astartes adorned the walls alongside banners captured from Imperial Guard regiments. Weapons of defeated champions hung from chains, their edges still bearing the stains of bloodshed in battles fought decades or centuries ago. At the centre of the chamber stood an altar bearing the symbol of the Black Legion, the Eye of Horus rendered in materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A champion of the Legion presided over the ceremony, his armour bearing the scars of countless battles and decorated with honours earned through service to Abaddon. He addressed the assembled neophytes in a voice that resonated with transhuman bass frequencies, explaining what would be required of them. They would serve the Warmaster without question or hesitation. They would fight the long war until victory was achieved or death claimed them. They would show no mercy to the Imperium's servants, for the Imperium had earned only destruction through its crimes. They would embrace the gifts of chaos while never allowing themselves to become slaves to any single god. They would make themselves into weapons pointed at the heart of the false Emperor's realm. Each neophyte approached the altar individually and spoke the words of the oath. The exact phrasing varied, but the essential content remained consistent. They renounced their former allegiances, declared their loyalty to Abaddon and the Black Legion, committed themselves to the long war without reservation. As they spoke, they felt something change within them, a sensation that transcended the merely physical. The oath bound them on levels both material and spiritual, creating connections that linked them to the Legion in ways that defied conventional understanding. They belonged now. They were no longer merely individuals who had survived transformation and training. They had become part of something larger, something that had existed for 10,000 years and would continue existing long after their personal deaths. The oath ceremony concluded with the neophytes receiving their armour. Black Legion power armour represented a significant departure from the equipment issued to loyalist Astartes. The ceramite plates bore the same basic structure, but decades or centuries of exposure to the warp had transformed them. The armour might display organic qualities, the surface resembling something alive rather than purely mechanical. It might bear decorations that moved of their own accord, demonic faces shifting their expressions, runes rearranging themselves into new configurations. The neural interface provided by the candidate's black carapace allowed the armour to become an extension of his body, but with Black Legion armour, that extension sometimes felt like it possessed desires and aversions independent of the wearer's intentions. The armour's coloration varied depending on the warband to which the newly sworn warrior was assigned. The traditional black with gold trim dominated, but individual warbands incorporated elements that reflected their particular character or the favour they enjoyed from specific gods. A warband devoted to Khorne might add brass fixtures and decorative skulls. A warband that served Nurgle might allow rust and corrosion to spread across their armour's surface, the decay itself becoming a form of decoration that demonstrated their god's blessing. The essential black remained, marking them all as servants of the Warmaster, but the variations signified the diversity the Black Legion encompassed. Assignment to a warband marked the final transition from neophyte to full warrior. The newly sworn found themselves integrated into existing units, placed under the command of champions who led small groups in service to greater lords who themselves answered to Abaddon's chosen commanders. The Black Legion operated through this hierarchical structure, maintained discipline through chains of command that ensured orders flowed from the Warmaster down to the lowest warrior. But the structure remained more flexible than loyalist equivalents. A warrior who distinguished himself through valour or cunning could rise rapidly. A champion who failed or showed weakness might find himself demoted or simply killed by subordinates who saw opportunity in his decline. The warbands themselves varied enormously in character and composition. Some consisted primarily of veterans from the Heresy era, warriors who remembered the Siege of Terra and had fought continuously for 10 millennia. These ancient combatants possessed skills refined through endless practice, tactical knowledge accumulated across centuries of warfare, and mutations that reflected their long exposure to chaos. They served as the Legion's elite, the warriors who led the most difficult assaults and held positions when retreat would mean catastrophic defeat. Other warbands incorporated more recent recruits, renegades from loyalist chapters who had turned traitor in the millennia since the heresy. These warriors brought fresh perspectives and sometimes retained equipment or knowledge their ancient brothers had lost. The newly sworn warriors began their service through relatively simple duties: guard rotations, maintenance of equipment, participation in minor raids against targets that posed minimal threat. They learned the rhythms of life aboard the Black Legion's vessels, the way time lost meaning in the warp where days and years became interchangeable concepts. They discovered that serving chaos meant accepting levels of horror that would have broken their previous selves. They witnessed slaves being sacrificed to empower sorcerous rituals. They watched as defeated enemies were transformed into servitors or simply discarded like broken tools. They participated in atrocities that served no tactical purpose beyond spreading terror and feeding the ruinous powers. Combat initiation came inevitably. The Black Legion maintained a constant operational tempo, launching raids against Imperial holdings, attacking rival Chaos warbands, striking at Xenos forces that threatened their territories within the Eye of Terror. The newly sworn warriors found themselves thrust into battle situations where their training and transformation would be tested against genuine threats. Some discovered they possessed natural talent for warfare, their transhuman capabilities combining with psychological conditioning to make them efficient killers. Others struggled, their minds rebelling against the violence even as their bodies performed the actions required of them. A few proved unable to function in combat, their psychological integration incomplete despite having survived the physical transformation. These failures were dealt with swiftly, their gene seed harvested and their bodies disposed of without ceremony. Those who succeeded in combat discovered something unexpected. The act of fighting, of killing the Imperium's servants, produced satisfaction that transcended merely following orders. They felt righteous in their violence, convinced that each enemy they destroyed represented a blow against tyranny and oppression. The psychological conditioning had worked exactly as intended, transforming them into warriors who believed completely in the justice of their cause. They were not merely following orders or pursuing personal glory. They were fighting the long war, continuing the struggle that Horus had begun, working toward the eventual victory that would see the Imperium shattered and humanity freed from the false Emperor's chains. The Chaos gods themselves took notice of warriors who distinguished themselves through exceptional service. A warrior who killed with particular enthusiasm might feel Khorne's attention, manifesting as increased strength and aggression. A warrior who survived wounds that should have killed him might receive Nurgle's blessing, his body developing resistance to injury and disease that exceeded even standard Astartes' resilience. A warrior who demonstrated exceptional cunning might gain Tzeentch's favour, manifesting as enhanced strategic insight or minor psychic abilities. A warrior who pursued perfection in combat might attract Slanesh's interest. his skills refined to levels that approached supernatural excellence. These gifts came with prices, mutations that mark the warrior as chaos-touched, psychological changes that brought him closer to the gods while pushing him further from baseline humanity. The Black Legion's approach to these divine gifts reflected their philosophy of chaos undivided. Warriors were encouraged to accept blessings from any god that offered them, but warned against becoming so devoted to a single deity that they lost sight of the Legion's collective purpose. A warrior marked by Khorne remained valuable so long as he could control his bloodlust enough to follow orders. A warrior blessed by Tzeentch contributed as long as his scheming served the War Master's strategies rather than his own ambitions. The balance proved difficult to maintain, and some warriors did fall completely into the service of individual gods, but the Black Legion worked to prevent such losses through careful oversight and ruthless intervention when necessary. Service to the Black Legion meant existence defined by warfare, punctuated by periods of preparation for more warfare. The warriors knew nothing resembling peace. Even when not actively engaged in combat operations, they trained. They maintained their equipment. They participated in rituals meant to secure the favour of the ruinous powers. Their lives had become weapons pointed perpetually at the Imperium, their every action calibrated to advance the Long War's objectives. They would fight until death claimed them, and even then their gene seed would be harvested to create new warriors who would continue the struggle. The cycle was endless, had been endless for 10,000 years, would remain endless until either the Imperium finally fell or the Black Legion was destroyed completely. The transformation from captured slave to Black Legion warrior represented a journey measured not merely in physical changes, but in fundamental alterations to identity, purpose, and understanding of reality itself. The boy who had been taken from an imperial world no longer existed in any meaningful sense. His memories remained, but they felt like they belonged to someone else, a different person who had lived in ignorance of the truths that now seem self-evident. The Emperor was a tyrant. The Imperium was a prison. Chaos offered freedom and power. These were not beliefs to be argued or questioned. They were facts as certain as gravity or mortality. The newly created warrior looked upon the Imperium with hatred refined through his transformation and training. He saw it as his enemy not merely because orders designated it so, but because he believed completely in its guilt and the necessity of its destruction. He would fight against it with every capability his transhuman body possessed. He would show no mercy because mercy was a luxury the Long War could not afford. He would embrace the gifts of chaos because they made him stronger and better equipped to fulfill his purpose. He had become exactly what the Black Legion needed him to be. Another weapon in an arsenal that had been accumulating for 10,000 years. Another warrior devoted absolutely to the War Master's vision of a galaxy, purged of the false Emperor's influence. The horror of Black Legion recruitment lay not merely in the physical brutality of the transformation process, or the psychological torture of the conditioning. The true horror resided in its effectiveness. The Legion took ordinary humans, children stolen from Imperial worlds, and transformed them into warriors who genuinely believed in their cause. They created true believers who would fight and die willingly for ideals that would have revolted their previous selves. The process destroyed who they had been, and rebuilt them as something new, something that served purposes they would once have considered evil, but now embraced as righteous and necessary. And the cycle continued without end. Every raid produced more captives who might prove suitable for transformation. Every battle yielded gene seed from fallen warriors that would create new candidates. Every world that fell to the Black Legion provided resources that sustained their war machine. The Legion grew slowly but steadily, absorbing renegades from loyalist chapters, incorporating survivors from smaller war bands, creating new warriors from stolen children. They had been doing this for 10,000 years. They would continue doing it until the Imperium fell or the galaxy itself ended. The Long War permitted no other possibility, acknowledged no alternative outcome. Victory or oblivion. Those were the only futures the Black Legion recognized, and they would sacrifice anything, transform anyone, commit any atrocity necessary to ensure that victory became reality.